The morning of March 2, 1943, broke quietly over the Bismarck Sea, the kind of deceptive calm that had fooled men before. At 0630 hours, the ocean below looked almost peaceful, a flat steel blue sheet broken only by long white wakes slicing southward through the water. High above that stillness, crouched in the cockpit of a modified B-25 Mitchell bomber, Colonel Paul Pappy, Gunn leaned forward and stared down at the enemy convoy that had dominated his thoughts for months. 8 Japanese destroyers moved in disciplined formation around 8 troop transports, their escorts cutting sharp arcs through the sea as they shepherded nearly 7,000 soldiers toward New Guinea. If those ships reached shore, the entire balance of the campaign could tilt back in Japan's favor. Gunn was 43 years old, a former Navy aviator turned Air Force's mechanic, a man who smelled perpetually of oil and hot metal. For 8 months, everything he had done to prepare for this moment had technically been illegal. His superiors had told him his bomber modifications were reckless. Fellow pilots joked that stuffing the nose of a medium bomber with .50 caliber machine guns would make it fly like a brick. When Gunn had first welded gun mounts into a B-25 fuselage back in his Townsville workshop, the base commander had ordered him to remove what he called that abomination and return the aircraft to standard bombing configuration. Standard doctrine was sacred. Medium bombers climbed to 5,000 or 6,000 feet, leveled out, and released their bombs through a Norden bomb sight, trusting mathematics and altitude to do the killing. Gunn believed that doctrine was killing Allied crews instead. His idea was simple, brutal, and completely against the book. Fly at mast height, 10 to 20 feet above the waves. Come in so low the ship's gunners barely had time to breathe. Rake the decks with enough firepower to pin down every anti-aircraft position. Then drop bombs so close they couldn't miss, either skipping them across the water or smashing them directly into the hull at point-blank range. To make that possible, Gunn had torn the soul out of the bomber. The bombardier's station was gone. The belly turret was ripped out. The glass nose was replaced with steel and gun barrels, more guns than any bomber had ever carried. When all 18 fired at once, the aircraft shuddered so violently that rivets popped loose and instruments blurred. The plane became dangerously nose-heavy. Test pilots complained the vibration rattled their teeth and loosened their fillings. Gunn didn't care. He had convinced General George Kenny to let him try anyway, telling him Japanese ships wouldn't know what hit them when a bomber came screaming in at deck level with the firepower of a destroyer. Now, as Gunn watched the convoy below, their anti-aircraft guns already swiveling toward the approaching formation, he keyed his radio. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "This is what we built her for, boys," he said. "Time to see if 18 guns can do what the book says is impossible." Paul Gunn had always been the kind of man who fixed things that weren't supposed to be broken and broke things that weren't supposed to be fixed. Born in Quitman, Arkansas, on October 18, 1899, he learned to strip engines before he could properly tie his shoes. By the time he joined the Navy in 1917, he could rebuild a radial engine blindfolded in a rainstorm. His hands were permanently stained with grease, his uniform rarely quite regulation, and his reputation for making aircraft do impossible things followed him wherever he went, from the Navy to the Army Air Forces and across the Pacific to Australia. By March 1942, Gunn found himself staring at the most infuriating problem of his career: Japanese shipping convoys. Every few weeks, intelligence would report another convoy leaving Rabaul, steaming south toward La or Salamaua, packed with troops, food, ammunition, and equipment. Allied bombers would scramble, climb to altitude, and drop their bombs while Japanese fighters tore into them and anti-aircraft fire stitched the sky with black bursts. Most bombs missed completely, splashing harmlessly into the ocean. The few that hit rarely sank anything larger than a destroyer. And the convoys kept coming. Gunn watched the after-action reports pile up on his desk at the Townsville Depot repair facility. Mission flown. Bombs dropped. Minimal damage achieved. Crews lost. He understood exactly why it wasn't working. A bomb dropped from thousands of feet took half a minute to fall. In that time, a ship could change course just enough to escape. By the time the bomb reached the water, the target was already somewhere else. One afternoon, standing beside a Douglas A-20 Havoc that had limped home from a shipping strike with half its tail shredded and 3 crewmen dead, Gunn made a decision that would change the war. He walked slowly around the aircraft, mentally stripping away everything that made it conventional. The glass nose. The bombardier's seat. The defensive guns meant for high-altitude combat. What remained was a fast, stable airframe with room for something entirely different. "We don't have a ship killer yet," he told his crew chief, Sergeant Bill Harris. "But we're going to build one." The idea was brutally simple. Instead of attacking from altitude, the aircraft would come in at wave-top level, so low the sound of the engines blended with the ocean. It would carry enough forward-firing guns to silence every deck weapon it encountered. Then it would drop bombs so close the ship wouldn't have time to react. Gunn installed 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns in the A-20's nose. 2 more went into side-mounted pods. Extra fuel tanks replaced the internal bomb bay. For 3 weeks, Gunn and his mechanics worked 18-hour days, fabricating mounts, rerouting cables, and fighting gravity as they tried to balance the aircraft. When they finished, it looked like nothing in any manual. The test flights were promising and terrifying. At 50 feet above the water, the A-20 could approach nearly undetected. When the guns fired, the deck of a target ship simply vanished under a storm of bullets. But the vibration was severe, rivets popped, and the aircraft wanted to bury its nose into the runway during landing. Senior officers were unimpressed. The modifications violated regulations. They endangered crews. One colonel called it a flying violation of common sense. But Japanese convoys were growing larger, not smaller, and conventional attacks were still failing. When Gunn took his idea to General George Kenny, the new commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, Kenny listened. "Pull the bombardier out," Kenny said. "Fill the nose with 0.50 calories. Let's see what happens." The B-25 Mitchell was stronger than the A-20, with twin engines and a tougher airframe. Gunn's team tore it apart. The Norden bomb sight was removed. Plexiglass was replaced with steel. Gun mounts multiplied. Early versions carried 6 or 8 guns. Gunn pushed for more. He wanted 18. The aircraft became nose-heavy monsters that shook themselves apart when all guns fired at once. Pilots complained they handled like trucks. Instruments cracked. Plexiglass shattered. Gunn kept going. Intelligence reported another convoy forming at Rabaul. 8 transports, nearly 7,000 troops, bound for La. On the night of March 1st, Gunn sat alone in his workshop, writing by the light of a single bulb. Outside, mechanics worked through the darkness, installing the last guns into aircraft that would never carry bombardiers again. By dawn, 12 modified B-25s sat on the flight line, their noses bristling with gun barrels. Each carried 500 rounds per gun. When all 18 fired together, they could deliver more than 13,000 rounds per minute. More firepower than many warships. The vibration was so intense that pilots could barely read their gauges. Landing required nerve and finesse. But the advantage was overwhelming. Flying at 10 to 20 feet above the water, they would be invisible until the last moments. Training took place in Port Moresby Harbor using a wrecked Japanese transport as a target. Pilots learned to judge distance at wave-top height, where depth perception failed and mistakes were fatal. Many officers believed it was suicide. Gunn believed it was the only way. The attack plan was complex. B-17s would strike first from altitude, forcing the convoy to maneuver. Australian Beaufighters would then sweep in at deck level to silence anti-aircraft guns. Only then would Gunn's Strafers attack. At 0630 on March 2nd, the first B-17s appeared. Vice Admiral Masatomi Kimura watched them through binoculars from the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki. He had seen this before. High-altitude bombs fell. Water erupted. One transport was damaged. The convoy kept moving. Then the Australians came. Beaufighters roared in at wave-top height, spraying cannon fire and rockets. Anti-aircraft crews were cut down at their guns. Smoke filled the air. Kimura began reorganizing his defense when lookouts shouted a new warning. Twin-engine bombers were coming in impossibly low from the west. Through his binoculars, Kimura saw the strange noses bristling with metal. These were B-25s, but not like any he had faced before. They came in at mast height. Major Ed Larner held his course as tracers streaked past his cockpit. At 400 yards, he fired. 18 guns roared. The deck of the transport ahead simply disintegrated. This was not bombing. This was execution. The Japanese convoy had never faced anything like what was now tearing into it. As the first wave of strafers ripped across the formation, the ocean itself seemed to erupt. Tracers stitched bright orange lines through smoke and spray, cutting across decks, bridges, and gun mounts with merciless precision. Sailors who seconds earlier had been loading anti-aircraft magazines were suddenly flung backward or vanished entirely as .50 caliber rounds punched through steel shields as if they were paper. The noise was overwhelming, a constant hammering roar that drowned out shouted commands and shattered the illusion of control aboard the ships below. Lieutenant Walter Lee, gripping the controls in one of the modified B-25s, felt the aircraft shudder violently as every gun fired at once. The vibration blurred his vision and rattled his bones, but the sight ahead of him was unforgettable. A transport filled his windscreen, its superstructure collapsing under the concentrated fire as smoke poured from dozens of fresh wounds torn into its hull. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent one by one, their crews either dead, wounded, or driven flat against the deck, unable to raise their heads into the storm. The psychological shock was immediate. Japanese sailors were trained to face dive bombers and high-altitude attacks, to calculate lead and elevation, to track predictable arcs of descent. This was something else entirely. The aircraft were coming straight at them, so low that the curvature of the sea hid them until the last seconds. There was no time to aim, no time to coordinate defensive fire. Men ran. Some dove overboard, choosing cold water over certain death. Others froze, trapped by disbelief as the air itself seemed to turn solid with incoming fire. As the strafers closed to point-blank range, the second phase of Gunn's vision unfolded. Bomb release switches clicked. 1,000-pound bombs dropped from just 10 to 20 feet above the waves, struck the water, and skipped forward like stones thrown by giants. They slammed into hulls below the waterline, exactly where ships were most vulnerable. Explosions ripped open steel plates, sending columns of flame and seawater skyward. The destroyer Tokitsuke's took a direct hit along her port side. The blast was catastrophic. Her keel snapped, her engines tore loose, and the ship folded inward on itself. Within minutes, she was gone, disappearing beneath the surface before her crew could even comprehend what had happened. The transport Kyakusei Maru, already damaged earlier, was struck again. She listed sharply, rolled onto her side, and slipped under, taking hundreds of troops with her in a matter of moments. The entire low-level attack lasted less than 15 minutes, But when it ended, the convoy no longer existed in any meaningful sense. 8 transports were sunk or sinking. 4 destroyers were gone. Of the nearly 7,000 soldiers aboard those ships, fewer than 1,200 would ever reach La, most of them wounded, exhausted, and stripped of equipment. The sea was littered with debris, bodies, and oil slicks that spread in rainbow patterns across the water. By mid-morning on March 3rd, the Bismarck Sea lay eerily quiet. Allied aircraft circled overhead, hunting down the few surviving destroyers attempting to limp back toward Rabaul. Below them floated the unmistakable evidence of total destruction. Life rafts clustered around empty patches of water, helmets and packs bobbing among splintered wood and twisted metal. The ocean had become a graveyard. Walter Lee looked down from his cockpit as his damaged B-25 limped home. His ammunition boxes were empty now, their metal casings rattling loosely with each vibration of the airframe. Hydraulic fluid pooled at his feet. One engine coughed and sputtered, wounded but still turning. He tried to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had believed about warfare. 15 minutes earlier, an entire convoy had existed. Now it was gone. The success of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea exceeded even Gunn's boldest expectations. Intelligence officers initially questioned the numbers. It seemed impossible that so much destruction could have been inflicted so quickly with so few losses. But reconnaissance flights confirmed it. The convoy had been annihilated. Japanese reinforcement by sea to New Guinea had effectively ended in a single morning. Allied losses were shockingly light. 13 aircrew members were killed or missing, most from the earlier high-altitude phases rather than the strafers themselves. Several modified B-25s returned riddled with holes, shaken and scarred, but reparable. The imbalance was undeniable. For Paul Gunn, the victory was vindication, but it was not celebration. In the debriefing room at Port Moresby, he listened silently as pilots described their runs, noting every malfunction, every jammed gun, every structural failure. The concept had worked, but it was imperfect. Ammunition feeds needed improvement. Mounts needed reinforcement. The aircraft shook themselves apart under sustained fire. There was more work to be done. That night, Gunn walked alone along the shoreline near the wreckage of an earlier Japanese transport. Life vests and helmets lay scattered in the sand. He counted them without realizing he was counting. In his logbook, he wrote a single sentence: "Ships can be replaced. Men can't." It was not regret, exactly, but it was acknowledgement. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. Japanese naval planners understood the message clearly. Large surface convoys to New Guinea were no longer viable. Losses on that scale could not be replaced. Within days, they shifted to nighttime barge runs and submarine supply missions, methods that could deliver only a fraction of what had been lost. Japanese troops already ashore realized reinforcements were not coming. Morale collapsed. The initiative in New Guinea had shifted decisively to the Allies. Word of the battle spread quickly through Allied commands. Gunn's illegal experiment became required reading. North American aviation was ordered to incorporate the gunship concept into production models. The B-25J rolled off assembly lines with up to 18 forward-firing guns as standard equipment. Engineers strengthened nose sections, redesigned mounts, and reduced vibration. What had begun as a workshop gamble became official doctrine. The ripple effects extended across the Pacific. Modified B-25 Strafers appeared from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. Other aircraft followed the concept. The line between bomber and fighter blurred as heavily armed attack aircraft proved capable of destroying ships, airfields, and fortified positions with precision and speed. The modern fighter bomber was born in Gunn's workshop. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Strafers devastated Japanese positions that had resisted months of conventional bombing. Airfields were destroyed on the ground. Bunkers were erased. Troops learned to fear attacks that came without warning, roaring in at treetop height before vanishing just as quickly. Gunn himself was promoted and moved into headquarters roles he never truly wanted. Paperwork replaced welding torches. Meetings replaced late nights in the shop. He continued advising, visiting forward bases, and solving problems where he could, but the era of improvisation was over. His ideas had outgrown him. The cost of low-level attack never vanished. Casualty rates remained high. Flying at mast height meant facing every weapon the enemy could bring to bear. Many pilots who survived the Bismarck Sea did not survive the war. The aircraft remained difficult to fly, punishing to maintain, and physically brutal for crews. Yet the concept endured because it worked. By the war's end, Gunn's influence extended into post-war aviation. His ideas shaped ground attack doctrine, jet development, and the philosophy that aircraft should be built to dominate the battlefield directly, not merely operate above it. What he had proven was simple and dangerous. Innovation, applied ruthlessly, could change the course of a war. Paul Irvin Gunn died on October 11, 1957, when his civilian aircraft crashed in the mountains of the Philippines, the same region where his most famous creation had rewritten the rules of combat. He was 57 years old, still flying, still experimenting, still pushing limits. At his funeral stood pilots who had lived because of his stubborn refusal to accept failure as inevitable. Men who understood that victory sometimes comes not from doctrine or tradition, but from one person willing to bolt 18 machine guns into the nose of a bomber and trust that reality would bend before imagination and courage. The waters of the Bismarck Sea eventually swallowed the wreckage and the memories, but the legacy endured. In 15 minutes, naval warfare changed forever, not because of a grand strategy, but because a mechanic decided the book was wrong and proved it with fire.